Welcome to another edition of Conversations with CASA, a monthly news blog that explores issues and trends in the child welfare system. My name is Vicki Spriggs, and I'm the CEO of Texas CASA, and we're filming at our offices here in Austin, Texas. My guest today is Andrea Sparks. Andrea is the director of the Child Sex Trafficking Team for Texas. Andrea works with state and national leaders to develop and lead strategies to achieve the team's mission of preventing child sex trafficking. Before her appointment by the governor in 2016, Andrea served as the executive director for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Texas Regional Office. And many of you know her as the former director of public policy for Texas CASA. Welcome back, Andrea.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes, and congratulations on your new role.
Thank you.
Can you tell us about the work that your team does?
Sure. The legislature created our team under the governor's office, and our task is really to combat child sex trafficking with a very comprehensive approach. So we are looking at prevention and how to protect our children from child sexual exploitation, how to recognize these victims. Often that's a big problem. We're not identifying the victims that we do have in Texas, how to recover them. And by recover, I mean recover and help protect them rather than punish them. And we want to respond in an empowering and a protective way rather than a punitive way. That has been the past in Texas, with the juvenile justice system really being the only system that was recognizing these kids for a long time. And then also providing them the services they need in the long term to heal and thrive, and then of course prosecute their perpetrators to bring them justice.
Super. That's a mouthful and a lot of work.
Mouthful.
First, I have to say we're really proud of the leadership that the governor has taken in addressing this issue. How many comprise your team?
That's funny you ask. We just hired 2 more today. We are building a regional team, so we will have regional administrators in North, South, East, West, and Central Texas to help us represent the governor's office, help work with stakeholders to build a continuum of care for victims, and to really build local care coordination so that victims who are identified are not slipping through the cracks. So whether you are a child in the child welfare system or juvenile justice system or just a community kid, we're hearing more and more about kids who are getting lured and groomed on their smartphones or some kind of technology, then you will be able to have the benefit of this care coordination, you and your family, so that no kid really is slipping through the cracks.
Super. We know that foster youth are a highly susceptible population for trafficking.
Yes.
How does a CASA volunteer identify maybe a child who's being trafficked, and then what do they do?
Well, there are lots of indicators, but I will tell you that it's not that easy sometimes. And as a former attorney ad litem and child advocate, I look back now and I've missed the signs so many times. So many of the kids I represented were actually being exploited, and I did not see the signs. So there are indicators that are very common with our youth, especially in the child welfare system. As y'all know, CASA knows, these kids are often without a connection to a family, and I know y'all are working really hard on building those connections for them. That makes a huge difference. But connection to family, a feeling of belonging, a background of healthy, loving relationships. Trafficking is often seen as a disease or a crime of relationship, and traffickers and pimps and gangs who want to exploit our kids recognize when a child is vulnerable because they're lacking relationship, they're lacking connection, they're seeking attention, they want to feel loved and cared for. And so you have kids who are kind of reaching out for that either on social media or dressing differently, who are involved with older paramours, older boyfriends. That's a huge red flag for our youth. Children who are hanging out with older friends. We are seeing girls traffic other girls now, unfortunately. You know, we have pimps who are high school cheerleaders. We have traffickers who are teachers. We have whole gangs who are trafficking kids. I guess anytime that a child's behavior changes, and it's so hard because a lot of our kids are changing their behavior as they go through adolescence, but changing of dress, unexplained gifts, a secret or multiple cell phones or devices to get in touch with people, an older boyfriend, hiding things on social media, all of those are signs. Trauma. One of the things that makes it so hard to detect is that a lot of our victims have already suffered complex trauma. They're already in our child welfare system. They're already in the juvenile justice system. They've already been traumatized, sometimes by it's a head injury. We frankly have seen some victims be vulnerable to trafficking because of some kind of brain trauma. And so it's very hard to detect. And kids don't even know that they're being victimized sometimes because it's just the same thing that has happened to them in the past. So we're actually rolling out a screening tool. We brought a screening tool to Texas. We're delighted that both DFPS and the juvenile justice system have agreed to use the same tool. It takes 5 minutes to use, and based on what you know about a child, you can score the child on a tool and give them a level of risk, whether that's not enough information, no risk now, possible concern, or clear concern. And so we're training people around the state to use the tool and then to react appropriately when that clear concern is indicated. You will have special investigators now at DFPS using this tool. You will know, hopefully, when kids are coming into the system and into your advocacy, whether a child's been trafficked. But we know that so many kids are exploited and aren't showing us the signs yet. So if CASA sees something like I just described, any of those indicators, we urge you to call 911 if you think it's an emergency, and of course, as a mandatory reporter, call law enforcement. And keep pressing, because you may be in a location where law enforcement isn't really educated on this yet. So you can also call the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the National Human Trafficking Hotline as well.
Thank you. As I sit here and think about this, I guess first I have to give a shameless plug. You talked about the lack of connections, and so my shameless plug, of course, would be our collaborative family engagement efforts that we are piloting, or actually working with programs to roll out across the state, which brings family and other people, kinship care or kinship, people who have fictive kin, who are important to a child, to a table to build communities of support for each child in the system, and so that obviously is a useful tool. But I also know that so often with children who have been trafficked, that drive to go back to that connection, that pimp, that person who's trafficking them, is so strong that it's very hard to hold them in place. I know there's been some work through your office to help create some pilot sites across the state. Am I correct?
Yes.
To work with these kids. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So coming from CASA, right, having worked at CASA Texas CASA for almost 10 years, knowing the power of that advocate relationship and all of the things that it does to help kids in the foster care system, and then moving to this space where I'm seeing kids who are already vulnerable be, brutally trafficked and exploited. The one thing, it was like aha moment when people ask me, how can I prevent this from happening? Become a CASA. Become a CASA volunteer. The advocates who connect with these kids and who really advocate on their behalf for permanency or for other connections, like your family engagement piece, that's just huge, and that gives kids the best chance to really avoid being trafficked in the first place and avoid being vulnerable to a trafficker. But I would say that the other piece is just, these kids need as many connections as possible. And so when you are advocating for them to either go back to family or go back to maybe a new family, that really helps with the trauma response. When they want to go back to a trafficker, it's not that they're being a delinquent, they're not being a juvenile delinquent, they're not being bad. It's a trauma response. And these traffickers, sometimes they're not the brightest people in the world, right? But they're excellent manipulators. And they actually create, on purpose, a trauma bond with these victims. So it's kind of what torturers do in the Middle East or anywhere in our world where people are tortured. They will actually inflict extreme abuse on our kids, physical, of course, sexual abuse, having to do many dates a night, emotional abuse, and then intermittently give them small acts of kindness. And that kind of pattern actually creates a trauma bond. And so we talk to a lot of survivors, and I'm not a mental health professional, but survivors have told us that trauma bond is so strong that even when you're about to die, you will stay with that trafficker because you feel like it's your only way to survive. It's a defense mechanism, and it's the only thing you can do to stay alive. So that's what we're dealing with. That's what we're fighting against. The good news is our pilot sites that we are doing, we are creating advocacy for child sex trafficking victims. Not too different from what CASA does, but it's not court-appointed advocacy. It's more personal advocates for these kids. The minute they are recovered from a situation when they're being trafficked, law enforcement can call an advocate out. Many times it's a survivor advocate, so someone who's already lived through this. These kids don't trust many people, obviously. Right. They've seen people be fake to them, and they, in order to respond, sometimes they need someone to say, hey, I went through this too. So those advocate programs show up, respond, really create a healthy relationship with that kid, and can be in that relationship with that child and supporting them and doing some case management and helping their family for years, whether the court's involved or not, or whether they go in and out of court. The exciting thing is that we have such a strong CASA network here in Texas. We believe that CASA advocates in Texas can do some of this. And so we're working with Dallas CASA to create a curriculum that would allow them to train CASA advocates and their supervisors on exactly how to do this. So it's CASA Plus, and it's CASA with a little more information about that trauma bond and how to counteract it. So we're super excited about that curriculum. I believe it's going to be the first in the country for CASA.
Super. Andrea, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for what you're doing. And again, I thank the governor for his leadership in this arena. And I want to thank you for joining us for another edition of Conversation with CASA. We'll see you next time.